So, guys, welcome to week 8. I know this is really late coming. I was kind of outlining how I wanted to go, sort of figure out how I was going to schedule out the next couple of weeks. So, it took a little bit longer than I wanted, which is what it is. Obviously, we are focusing a lot on the second wave of feminism as this sort of biggest wave. The first wave is a bit smaller, with the second wave encompassing many more women and movements, and there's so much that we can't fit into it as well. But we talked about the feminine mystique and white middle class housewives, and so now we're focusing on Black women and BIPOC women as well to sort of figure out what everyone else is going through in the 1950s and 1960s. So obviously there's sort of these sexual constructs that are being built around women in general, but they are different for different races of women because of the events and oppression as well. So when we talked about in week 6 was obviously the feminine mystique and how we saw that breaking down for white women in the 1950s and the 1960s through advertisements and that sort of thing. And we will talk about that to some extent later in the presentation. But obviously we have white women having a much different experience than Black women during this time period because of oppression and because of different issues that come up in this time period as well. So we'll talk a little bit about Jet and Ebony magazine. I'll show you some different issues, and then I'll bring up sort of advertisements and that sort of thing much later on in the presentation. So during this period, the civil rights movement is a big part of Black women and Black men's lives from the 50s into the 60s. And so a lot of our conversations about Black women will be their role in civil rights, even as mothers and working women. A lot of their lives are devoted to the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Black Power movements and Malcolm X. So all of those things are occurring in the 50s and 60s that obviously white women are not necessarily a part of as extensively. Even Betty Friedan talks about feminists we need a political movement, a social movement like that of the Blacks, which sounds a little icky. I don't know what word I wanted now, but she very much felt like in the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement was able to achieve things that the feminist movement did not. So that's sort of a side note here as we move through. But we have, we're going to talk about a lot of Black women in the civil rights movement. Hundreds of African American women organized and led grassroots efforts during the civil rights era, showing new Black women leadership. Some were college-educated club women, while others were grassroots organizers. Some were young adults displeased with the conditions of Black, poor, and working-class people, while others were middle-aged women whose lives were testaments of struggle and survival. So in the mid-1960s to 70s, as well as the 50s, Black women were in a difficult position between civil rights and feminist movements. Where did they fit in? They had been the backbone of the civil rights movement, but their contributions were de-emphasized as Black men, often emasculated by white society, felt compelled to adopt patriarchal roles. When Black women flocked to feminist movements, white women discriminated against them and devoted little attention to class issues that were seriously affecting Black women, who tended to also be poor. This quote is quite ironic because, as you may think, oh, well, this seems very reminiscent of what we were literally just talking about 3 or 4 weeks ago with the first wave, right? Which is that women are still suffering the same issues with feminism and the civil rights movements that they're still not being accepted in. And so when they try to fight for feminism, they're being rejected by white women. And when they're trying to work for civil rights movements, they're being rejected by Black men. And so we'll see that with Martin Luther King Jr. being such a big figure in the civil rights movement, but where are the female leaders? Why are they not talked about? So because they're sort of pushed to the back or the sides of the conversation in general. And so again, you have Black women being put in that position, and that's something that we talked about with Christopher LeBron as well, where we're talking about Audre Lorde and Anna Julia Cooper, that these people are being pushed, Black women are being pushed back because they have racism and sexism to deal with. And we talked a lot about the suburbs last week, um, 2 weeks ago. I will do it, I swear. Because of the Federal Housing Administration, founded in 1934, people are trying to keep Black families out of the suburbs. So when we talked about this Federal Housing Administration, that the government was trying to support white families as they moved back into the homes, into suburbs, by building these suburban areas. This was not something that they provided to Black families. Even sort of specifically, the founder of Levittown did not support Black families and was quite racist. And most often this is called sort of redlining, which does somewhat occur even today. And Richard Rothstein talks about it in his book, The Color of Law. But Black families were pushed into urban housing projects while government promoted housing for white middle class and lower class families. And the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, would refuse to insure mortgages in a near Black neighborhoods. This policy was known as redlining. So banks could refuse these loans to these inner city neighborhoods where minorities lived, saying that they were risky investments, and they would show these on maps by redlining them out so that people would be able to see them. And in reality, this wasn't actually an issue. So this was the concept that was kind of touted to the people living there, or to people who were asking them about sort of the morality of these issues. Well, they'd say that they were risky investments, which was in fact not true, and never actually sort of proven. I think I even read something that said that Black families would pay more to be in these neighborhoods, and actually, so it was an even better of investment. So there was no proof that this was actually happening. And you can even see it in maps like of Milwaukee County, where people would do this to sort of not support the funding of these particular areas. They would also, the Federal Housing Administration will also subsidize builders who would mass produce subdivisions, but only if they promised not to sell their homes to Black families. I even read in an article, I probably have the citation in the notes as I usually do, or the link that is, that even today, some of these deeds still have these sort of racist clauses. So the tenant agrees not to permit premises to be used or occupied by any other persons than members of the Caucasian race. So even people signing these leases today sometimes still have these hidden kind of clauses in their leases, and probably not intentionally by or hopefully not intentionally by these towns, but just because it's part of this sort of language that's occurred for so long in these leases. I hope it's not the case anyway. We can always hope, I suppose. Now, the first Black family did move into Levittown, William and Daisy Myers, which was pretty controversial at the time. And they were able to get in through a loophole because the people selling the home were able to sell whoever they wanted to, and they sold it to a Black family. So this William and Daisy Myers, the couple, moved in. And they experienced a lot of violence and abuse on their lives, including crosses and that were lit on fire, as well as sort of KKK threats. Confederate flags hung from windows, as well as different mobs waiting as well. And you would see signs like, "We want white tenants in our white community." So you can imagine this sort of blatant racism and this sort of fear that this family would have experienced. And there's a whole documentary about it. I'll show you here a quick clip. But I really would recommend watching it because it really gives you an idea of what's going on in Levittown at this time.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people midway between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey. With its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees, it is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. Levittowners are people of modest initial policy and provided a minimum of essential services. When the houses were sold, naturally, he went to its own slender resources. In August 1957, Levittown, Pennsylvania attracted international attention when violence erupted as William Myers, Jr. and his family moved into the three-bedroom house at Daffodil and Deep Green Lanes. In almost all respects, the Myers family is close to the Levittown norm. They have 3 small children, the youngest only 1 month old. Myers served for 2.5 years in the Army and was discharged as a staff sergeant. He works as a laboratory technician and is studying for a degree as an electrical engineer. His wife, Daisy, is a college graduate. The Myers home is modestly furnished, and their late model family car was bought on time. They are very close to the Levittown norm, except in one respect. William Myers, Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community. Levittown reacted in a number of ways.
And they get sort of into asking women how they feel about having this family here. I'll show you one clip quick. And you can watch this on your own.
Tension develops and feeds on suspicion and mistrust. What has been the effect of the Myers coming here?
Well, it's created a great deal of tension, not among the neighbors, because we all feel the same. But it's naturally made everyone tense in their home. I mean, this is affecting our homes. And it's bound to create tension. It's the subject that's talked about all the time.
But there are others who are for the Myers?
Yes, I've read about them.
For what reason, do you think, do they support the Myers?
Frankly, I don't know what reasons they can have for it. If they are homeowners in Levittown, I don't see what reasons they can have for it.
Do you think Myers will be able to live here comfortably?
Comfortably? No.
What course of action are you going to follow?
I'll do what I can to help to get them out legally and peacefully. And as far as accepting them socially, if that's what you mean, I could never do that.
To take sides in such a situation.
And you can see sort of the horrific way that these people act, right? And treat this family moving into this neighborhood. And think about the way that, like, Donald Trump talks about suburbia and not wanting to bring those people into their suburbs, right? And ruin their suburbs, right? The same idea and fear and construct, right? That is not the only fear that it breeds, right? Is this sort of racist fear of people who are not like you, right? The same as William and Daisy Myers, who did continue to live there and did not sort of receive any physical harm. So in 1968, we have the passing of the Fair Housing Act, which did allow for Black families to now buy homes in Daly City and Levittown without sort of experiencing any discrimination from those loans. But by that time, they were far from affordable. They had been affordable before that, but now these houses had become more and more expensive, that people could not afford to live there. It was not this like $7,000 home anymore that was easily funded through the government. We do have a large population of women in the workforce during the 1950s as well. So while only 37% of white women are in the workforce in 1950, 57% of Black women worked outside the house by this time. And there are a lot of different industries. Women of NASA, obviously, if you've seen the Hidden Figures film with Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan. as well as other industry workers. So, when it came to women staying at home with their children, welfare packages often enabled poor lone white mothers to stay at home and provide care, while they didn't sort of allow the same for black women. There were discriminatory public policies have reinforced the view of black women as workers rather than as mothers and contributed to the black women's economic precarity. Up until the 1960s, caseworkers excluded more poor black women from receiving cash assistance because they expected black women to be employed moms and not stay-at-home moms like white women. And there's obviously this sort of looming construct as well, of black women and black slaves taking care of white women's children. And that continued on into the 50s and 60s, with a lot of black women being domestic workers. And so by the 1960s, almost 90% of women in the South were domestic workers working for white families. While sort of the white middle class women had the choice to work or stay home, black women needed to do it out of necessity. Often because sort of black men's jobs were more precarious, and obviously sort of through different oppressive systems that required them to need to work outside the home. So black women were working as domestic workers with low wages, and they often sort of experience massive wage cuts, and some of them would get $1.50 per week for 11 to 12 hours of work per day, if you can even imagine such a thing. Though society has done an exceptional job of portraying these nannies and maids as dutiful, self-sacrificing black women who love their white families and their children every bit as much as their own, and as one of the family, this notion could not be further from reality of the women who worked in these homes. And they were often able to create sort of chains of communications, and they could inform each other about white families that were poor or abusive. And white women did believe that there were injustices. However, by ascribing strength to black women, white women could ignore these injustices, their part in the continued exploitation and abuse of black domestics, and ignore their own guilt. Revealingly, although whites have devalued black women as mothers to their own children, black women have been the most likely of all women to be employed in low-wage women's jobs that involve cooking, cleaning, and caregiving, even though this work is associated with mothering more broadly. So while white women didn't really consider black women, black mothers, on the same level as them, as sort of in a sort of mothering, caring way, they were the ones often raising these white children. And so it became sort of this strange hypocrisy that was occurring in this system. As well. And there are a lot of women like Alice Walker, who was a famous poet, who talked about her mother, who was a domestic worker, and writing poetry about it, and they continued to be sort of disadvantaged and mistreated as part of sort of this dominant culture, as well. And you could see that in movies like, and books like The Help, which takes place in 1963, and where they talk about some of these issues as well. Oops. I also really stumbled upon this artist from South Africa who talks about domestic workers who are still a big part of South African culture and apartheid. And she made this alter ego, Sophie, who's a domestic worker, like Simande's mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. So she's made this cast of her own body and created a series empowering these domestic workers in South Africa, in creating them as sort of superheroes and these sort of authors of their own story in a lot of ways. They're really powerful, and I really got sort of encaptured by this work that she does, to sort of make these women the heroes of these stories. Bell Hooks has also talked about women working outside the home and the issues with that, surrounding sort of men and women, and how that sort of created interesting constructs between men and women, and sort of even today, that there's a separation between Black women and Black men, and how they sort of converse with one another. And that's all in her book, Ain't I a Woman, which I'm going to read for you here. So she's talking about this book where Gail Stokes writes an essay called Black Women to Black Men, or Black Woman to Black Man. And in this essay, she expressed hostility and contempt for those Black men who are reluctant to assume the provider role. I should guess not, you ignorant man. Why should they be in such a state where they've got maids like me to do everything for them? There's no screaming at the kids for her, no standing over the hot stove. Everything is done for her, and whether her man loves her or not, he provides. Provides. Do you hear that? Provides. And she talks about this sort of imperialism of patriarchy that encourages this kind of separation and anxiety that's kind of bred between Black men and women as well. Due in fact to some of this domestic work as well, and some of this conflict that occurs in the 60s and 70s, which we can't necessarily spend a bunch of time on, unfortunately. Alicia Garza, who's the one of the figures of the Black Lives Matter founders, she stated 80% of Black households are headed by Black women, and yet we make only 64 cents to every dollar that white men make. It's time for a change. Black women deserve equal pay. And today, even an average of 78% of Black women with children are employed, compared with 66% of white, Asian American, and Latina moms. Although 80% of Black mothers are breadwinners, the average they make is $36,000, which is 21% lower than white women. So this disparity still is a big part of the economy and oppression of Black women today.